These clay pits have certainly had a big impact on the Cornish landscape. They've been digging clay here for centuries. And as David Stafford's been finding out, dramatic events that happened here 100 years ago have left just as big a mark on local industrial history.
Cornwall's China clay industry is massive. Apparently, you can see these giant pits from the moon with the naked eye. For 2 centuries, it's been one of the region's major employers, providing work for up to 6,000 people. And the clay country was the scene of Cornwall's biggest ever industrial dispute, which lasted for 10 weeks during the long, hot summer of 1913. Thanks to some rare archive film, we're able to tell the story of that conflict through the words of those who fought on opposite sides.
We scattered them right down to the village. And believe me, some of our men went in the houses after them too.
They knew all the tricks. They were a corps trained especially for strike breaking.
Jenny Moore is taking me to the now disused pit, Carn Stents, where it all started. Many in her family have worked in the industry for generations. In the early days there were scores of small pits like this, mostly run as separate businesses. What was the work like? I mean, was it hard work?
It was very hard work. It was all manual labour. The clay was worked primarily by running a stream of water over the side of the pit. The clay then would go into suspension and run down to the bottom of the pit. And because sand is heavier than clay, the sand will settle out.
Yeah.
And the sandmen would then have to shovel the sand out of the sand pits.
Back-breaking.
Yes.
The Great Clay Strike started at Carn Stents on July the 21st, 1913, when around 30 men downed tools because the owner refused their demand for better pay. The years before the First World War were a period of great unrest.
Right across the country there were industrial disputes. The chain makers, the women in the Black Country were on strike, the milk workers in Chippenham, the railway workers. There were lots of disputes at this time, and that was clearly spreading.
2 years before the Carn Stents walkout, the Workers' Union had become active in the area, seeking better pay, conditions and a fairer society. In 1911, Charles Vincent, a socialist bookseller from Truro, was appointed an organiser for the Workers' Union in Cornwall. He made recruiting clay workers into a priority. Kent stayed in St Austell, and from here he launched his campaign. In December 1912, Vincent presented a petition with 2,500 signatures to the clay employers demanding a basic wage of 25 shillings a week. One of Vincent's early recruits was the late Frank Greet, seen here in 1969 in Charlestown. He told the BBC how the Carn Stents walkout quickly escalated into a dispute involving 5,000.
They came out on a Monday morning. The Saturday following, the Central Committee was called, which I was a member of, and after a long discussion, we decided to call in all the men on the next Monday. They were out for 25 shillings, you see.
Nigel Costley studied the dispute for a book to coincide with the centenary. He found that although the strike had overwhelming support, men on the eastern edge of the district continued to work.
In Bugle there seems to be that they were already getting the pay rate, and there was this sort of sense of why should we strike when we were already being paid slightly more than you. So there was that division within the workforce. It's interesting to read accounts of the mass meetings, the marches. There was an awful lot of walking from pit to pit. We're talking about quite significant distances that groups of clay workers, groups of women would organise pickets, and it was based on persuasion, going down into the pits to talk to people while they were working and trying to convince them to stop work.
In 1972, a drama based on the events that followed was broadcast by the BBC. It told how, on August the 28th, specially trained police from Glamorgan were sent to protect strikebreakers. The late Sergeant William Knipe was part of that real-life drama.
Well, you can just imagine what sort of a body of men they were. You see, I was one of the shortest ones there, and I was 6'1½".
They were a fine body of men, all over 6 feet. They up to every sort of game, you know. They knew all the tricks. They were a corps trained especially for strike breaking.
3 days after their arrival, the Glamorgans came here to bugle to keep a crowd of 1,000 pickets and supporters away from men still at work. It would result in the most dramatic confrontation of the whole dispute.
The Glamorgans had chosen a lane with a clay burrow or a clay tip on one side,
a bit like
maybe
that
a bit
one.
like this. Yeah. And on the other side of the road there was also a high bank with a hedge on the top, a Cornish hedge on the top. So the strikers were trying to get up, were sort of trapped in this narrow lane.
They said, "You're not allowed up this way," and the organiser said, "This is a public road." They said, "No, you're not going."
"You are an unlawful assembly."
The police ordered the crowd to disperse. They were now on a collision course with the strikers.
They said, "We will go." So the man in charge said, "Charge."
When we charged, from our previous experience, there's no messing about it. But we were only about 26 all told, going into a crowd of over 1,000. And when we got near them, of course, we started scattering them, right and left.
These two police batons were apparently found after the bugle confrontation. This one is the standard wooden truncheon in use at the time, said when it was found to still have traces of blood adhering to it, a grisly reminder of that police baton charge. But not nearly as grisly as this one, the so-called life preserver, which police officers used to buy privately. This one's made of solid metal and shows those Glamorgans really meant business.
There were two from St Dennis out there. It's not pretty bad, and one had an awful haircut, and his shirt was covered with blood. So the next morning, I got hold of it, and we took it up and put it up on the banner, you know, and we carried it around, and we sang the red flag in all seriousness, and we meant it.
The baton charge caused a national outcry and drove a wedge between the police and local people who'd previously shown them hospitality.
And the community evicted them from their lodgings, refused to serve them beer, refused to cut their hair. There was this community reaction against the South Wales Police and the way that they baton charged the crowd.
The majority of men stayed out, but the employers held firm. And with police protection in place for non-strikers, there was a steady drift back to work.
The problem was that they were being starved back to work. They could see no end in sight. Wealthy clay companies could probably hold out longer than families who weren't getting any money coming in. And so gradually people were forced back to work.
On the 12th of October, a union conference agreed a formal return to work. But for the bosses, it was a short-lived victory. Union membership continued to grow, and eventually employers had to abandon their hardline position.
The union built halls. There's pictures of the proud union committees in front of their new halls where they had weekly meetings, they had music, they had social events. There's this whole community being built around the union in the Clay area. And I think that the employers realised that they might have seen off the strike, but they hadn't seen off the union.
Indeed, within 6 months, the clay companies had agreed to all of the workers' demands. A century on, the workforce has been cut to around 1,000, but their wages and conditions are still among the best in the region.